let's welcome Kieran now to the program. Hello, how are you going?
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Lovely to have you. So I'm wondering if you could just start off by talking about saying what land you're from.
Yep, so I'm from the Wani Wandian clan of the Yuin Nation. The Yuin Nation is up on the south coast of what's now known as New South Wales. It stretches from about Nowra in the north down to near the Victorian border in the south.
Thanks so much. No, it's always good to start something off like that, isn't it? So let's lay it out bluntly, okay? Tell us about the Black People's Union and the opposition to the Voice, and talk about what concerns you.
Yep, so the Black People's Union, we're a First Nations organisation. We're run by blackfellas for blackfellas. We strive to seek progress in all fields of our lives, whether it be political, social, economical, we're just out here fighting for our people. Around the Voice in particular, though, we have taken up the No campaign. Ours isn't a conservative no, though, like many of the other people who are out there preaching that people should be voting no on a referendum. Ours is because we believe that the voice of Parliament just doesn't go far enough, and it's also got massive implications for stuff like our sovereignty and the future potential for us to progress further.
So, we all know that there have been whole tribes wiped out through wholesale massacres. I've talked a lot about that on the show. Chemical warfare, locking people up. Can you talk a little bit more about, how we can all unite? What can we do instead of the Voice?
Yeah, so what our aim is at the Black People's Union is to actually go out into communities and to try and get blackfellas together, rallying together, forming one pan-Aboriginal movement. And then, we're under the belief that if all of our mobs can come together, and, it is a massive task, it's something that we haven't actually seen here ever on this continent. But if all of our mobs can actually come together, then we'll have that collective bargaining power and that collective strength to be able to actually push for more and to actually able to enforce our sovereign rights and be self-determined people. Because at the end of the day, we haven't ceded our sovereignty, but sovereignty and the rights associated with that only go as far as we can actually enforce them and enact them. So it's one thing for us to be, sovereign people. It's a completely different thing for us to be able to have the power to act as sovereign people. And what the BPU is aiming to do is bring our mob together so we have that collective strength and power so that we can actually act as sovereign people.
Absolutely. And would you say that the culture has been attacked through laws and legislation?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, and we've got, we've got hundreds of years of history of that, going right back to, stuff like the White Australian policy, stolen generations, all of the acts and procedures and policies they brought in that forbade our people from able to, being able to speak their language and practice their culture and their customs. And even today, in terms of what's happening, the attacks against our culture and stuff, like you look at, for example, our children being taken by the government. Our children are taken at higher rates today than they were at any point during the official stolen generations policies. And it only gets worse and worse every year. Every year when they release new data, it just shows that our children are being taken at higher rates. And it's not just things like this. I'll give you a perfect example. My home country up in the Yuin Nation, my home community at Wreck Bay, their water supply has been polluted with PFAS by the naval base up there. Now, this has been ongoing for about 3 decades now, but it's to the point where my people in their home country can no longer go out into the bush and collect food. We can't go fishing anymore. We can't go collecting shellfish, and all of these cultural practices that have sustained us for tens or even hundreds of thousands of years, we can no longer practice because there's all this PFAS pollution in my community now, and the water's not safe to drink and the food's not safe to eat. And, this is just like 2 examples of the many ways in which they're constantly attacking our culture and attacking our people. There's heaps of other things I could talk about. We could talk about our world's highest incarceration rates and, the deaths in custody rates associated with that, and how our incarceration rates only get worse and worse each year as well. We could talk about stuff like the education programs that are in place and how, we do have some successes in terms of language programs and cultural programs, but there's also so many hurdles put in place that our people have to overcome to be able to even get a glance at achieving any sort of success in these areas.
So really what you say, I'm so glad that you've talked about this, because, I mean, I'll be honest with you, like, I've heard a lot of really, really bad radio at the moment for First Nations people. I am actually disgusted. I'm absolutely disgusted with the ways that some radio commentators in many ways make Aboriginal people look ridiculous who are opposed to the voice, and even ones who are not opposed to the voice. We have to be able to talk about things properly and not to make everything about politics. It's got to be about grassroots.
Yeah.
So with that angle, I just want you to, if you can, because I'm sure there's listeners that don't really know, right? Can you talk about what is the voice and having the Aboriginal people in the Constitution, because I know that needs to be included. Tell us what it is, and then tell us about why the Black People's Union doesn't agree.
Yep, no worries.
Let's leave out Peter Dutton. I mean, he's irrelevant.
No worries. So I suppose the most simplest, easiest way I can explain what the voice is the government is setting up this tokenistic body, and at the end of the day, that's all it is, just a tokenistic act. It's just, them giving themselves a pat on the back to say, look how good we are, look what we're doing for, the blackfellas. But at the end of the day, it doesn't actually do anything to help, our everyday people out on the street. It's not going to give us any sort of power to make decisions for ourselves. We've got, no right to come in and make any vetoes about any government legislation that gets made about us. Even the state itself, like there's no actual provision in place that says the government has to listen to this voice or has to take what the voice is recommending on board. And we've had literally dozens of examples of similar voices before, going back well over 50 years, like, going right back to the NACC back in 77 to 73. It was pretty much the same thing as what they're establishing now, except back then, 50 years ago, even then they recognised that this should be something that was decided by Indigenous people. So back then, when they had the vote on this, it was only Indigenous people who could vote on this. But whereas today, they're opening up these votes to 97% of the population who aren't Indigenous, and it's just paternalism at the end of the day. It's these non-Indigenous people coming in, deciding what's best for us, as if we don't have the ability to decide for ourselves what's best for us. And, it's along the lines as well of, all the dozens of stuff that's happened before, like the definition, sorry, I'm rambling a bit here, but, you look at the definition for insanity. The definition for insanity is trying the same action over and over again, but expecting a different result. Now, we've had well over 50 years of these things. Every single parliament since Keating has established their own Indigenous advisory body of some form or another. We've had stuff like the NACC, we've had APSIC, we've had all different sorts of coalitions of Aboriginal advisory groups, and none of them have been able to actually achieve anything to help our people. We're in the 21st century. We've still got some of the worst stats of the whole entire world. None of these previous advisory bodies have been able to do anything about that, but now we're supposed to believe that some new advisory body, which has just the same amount of power or even less power than some of these previous ones, is somehow going to be able to, solve our situation.
Some would also argue, though, that internationally, in other parts of the world like America and Sweden, Sweden, I think, has a voice, isn't it, to Parliament?
Yeah, actually, they're great ideas. The Sami do have a voice over in Finland, it is, in the Finnish government.
Sorry? Yep.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Over in the Finnish government. But that's another perfect example of why this wouldn't work. Because we look at what's happening over in their government, and all the time, and again, their government has way more power, this Sami government over in Finland, they've got way more power than what's being proposed for our voice, but yet their people still have massive incarceration rates, massive homeless rates, massive, rates of illiteracy and unemployment. Their government hasn't been able to solve their crisis. And their government is also constantly attacked by the mainstream Finnish government. It was only a month or two ago I was reading an article that listed off dozens of treaty violations that the Finnish government has made in regards to this Sami government over there. And again, like you look at America, they've got, all of these treaties, they've got these different advisory bodies set up over in the US and in Canada. But again, you just only have to look at their stats, same as the Māori over in New Zealand, only have to look at their stats. They're 10 times more likely to be locked up, to be homeless, to be unemployed, to be illiterate, or to be suffering some sort of chronic illness or disease. Now, treaties and voices over there haven't done anything for them to be able to mitigate these stats. Why would we think that it'll do anything different here in Australia?
Kieran, I wanted to, at this point, read out a quote that it was in a Sydney Criminal Lawyers. Do you remember doing an interview with them?
Yep.
Oh, it's an excellent, your voice shines through. And let me read this out, what you've said. For the average mainstream Australian, taking the voice approach to issues will create the illusion of general consent across the broader Indigenous population and paint any of us that oppose the sentiments and interests that the voice backs as radical outcasts in the eyes of the mainstream.
Yeah, exactly. And, that's just another factor. And you look at the wording the government released the other day about the voice, and this is going to be something that is going to be set up by the government of the day. So we have no guarantee that it'll even be our voices at the end of the day that end up there. And when we look at how all of these processes have gone in the past, we can be nearly certain that whatever voices do end up, I'm using my little air quotes here when I say representing us,
sure.
Whatever voices do end up representing us, how do we know that they're actually going to represent our interests and not just be some sort of parrot or echo chamber for the interests of capitalism and for the interests of the colonial government?
I'm so happy that you've come on because I've been wanting to talk to you for quite some time, but I also want to say one thing and I want to see what you think.
Yep.
In terms of, like this show today, you wouldn't have listened to all of it, but I've interviewed quite a few people. There was you, and the first person that I interviewed was Nicole Lee from the People with Disability Australia. I don't know whether you heard about the trans rally, the anti-trans rally.
Yep.
It was a quite terrible thing. And we were talking about Nazis, and we were talking about how there's so much hate speech to do with race, disability, homophobia. And then I interviewed Ian, and he's from the Refugee Action Coalition, and we're talking about that. So I'm wondering, like you're talking about how there needs to be an Aboriginal movement, and I quite agree. I think tribes need to unite. But how do we all unite as all peoples? How can we do that?
Yeah, it's not a simple answer. It is a massive question, and there's a lot of different approaches that people can take. Something that the DPU is focused on, though, is not just uniting Indigenous people, but uniting the wider proletariat, like the wider working class. Along those lines, we do have options for non-Indigenous allies who support our cause to come and join us to try and help with this movement and, to bring in their own perspectives as well. But at the end of the day, our sovereignty and our land back isn't just about the Indigenous people. It's about the entire broader working class. And the entire broader working class will only benefit from stuff like Indigenous sovereignty, self-determination and land back.
That's exactly right. And it's a big problem, though, because all of this stuff now is confused with the right-wing politics. People like, One Nation and, Liberal and all that. Yeah,
definitely. And it is hard waters to navigate, trying to have those conversations out in community with people, because, quite often you do start talking about certain words that have been co-opted lately by the right wing, and a lot of people, they just instantly go into that sort of dismissal mode of what you're saying. So, like another one, sovereignty, for example, we've talked about sovereignty here for generations and generations, us blackfellas. Now, lately we've had all these right-wing movements trying to co-opt those words to use for themselves. But, the difference obviously being that when we talk about sovereignty, we're talking about Indigenous nations as communities having sovereignty. And when these people talk about sovereignty, they're talking about some far-fetched notion of individual sovereignty where they're not answerable to anyone but themselves. Obviously very different things, one being communal, one being individualistic. But yeah, it is hard trying to have those conversations when a lot of our terms and phrases are being co-opted by the right.
Exactly. So what you're saying basically about the voices that you're saying we've had plenty of voices before, and it won't be the first Indigenous advisory board government has created.
Yeah, it won't be. There's been literally dozens of examples, and not just Indigenous, but when we look at other stuff as well, like royal commissions, for example, they carry a lot more power and a lot more authority and weight than this voice proposal has. But, how many recommendations from the Royal Commission to Aboriginal Deaths in Custody have been implemented? How many have been implemented from the Bring in Home report into the Stolen Generation? And not just Indigenous issues, but there's been dozens of other Royal Commissions into non-Indigenous issues where, again, these recommendations just don't get implemented. And if they won't listen to their own advisory boards and their own bodies, which carry more power and weight, what hope do we have that they'll listen to us?
But what can we do instead?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Instead, what we believe as the BPU is that our people should be working at coming together as one people, and then we can have that collective strength where we can actually demand more and we can actually push for more. Now, the government has spent 200-odd years of all these divide and conquer tactics. And again, like you see it recently, even in stuff like the Native Title Act. They brought in the Native Title Act back in the 90s. Howard's government reformed them all and turned them into divide and conquer techniques instead. So now you've got all these communities who have all these different issues with each other, just simply based around the way the government has set up the Native Title Act. Now, when we look at stuff like individual treaties as they're being proposed currently, and when we look at stuff like, these voices coming from, these different XYZ communities or, XYZ demographics, how do we know that this isn't, again, going to be some sort of continuation of these divide and conquer tactics that have been used against us successfully for 200 years? The only way we can possibly overcome that is by coming together as one people and one united voice, and then we can actually demand better and push for better. And we can actually, push for things like self-determination, because the voice isn't self-determination. And what we really have been asking for hundreds of years now, since colonisation began, is our own self-determination over our own affairs. And that's what the BPU is working towards by creating these united fronts between Indigenous people and creating this pan-Aboriginal movement. We're actually working towards being in a position where we can enforce our self-determination. Self-determination,
yeah. Well, let's hope that this can be achieved in our lifetime, because it's a total mess at the moment. I do all this stuff week in, week out. I attend inquests, of Aboriginal people who have died in custody. I do the coverage. I interview families. Where's it all going to go? What's going to happen in the end?
Yeah, it's a hard one. Look, nobody really knows the future, I suppose, at the end of the day. All we can do is just work towards our dreams and our goals. And I suppose at the end of the day, too, I take some sort of positive notion out of the fact that even if I don't see this through in my lifetime, what we're doing here is we're planting seeds, for trees that, we might not ever be able to enjoy the fruit and the shade of, but our kids or grandkids will be able to.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that I had you on, because you know what? I've made up for the bad radio. Kieran, thank you so much for coming on the program, and I'd love to invite you back on. I hope you will.
Yeah, no worries. Absolute pleasure. Yeah, and definitely hit me up. I'd be happy to jump on again.
I'll send you the link for the podcast when it comes out.
No worries. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
You too. Bye.
Bye.